move right on to our final session of the day, which is one of my favorites because it deals with something that has always been difficult when it comes to cyber, and that is attribution. We talked today about the possibility of using private sector companies to potentially disrupt adversaries, how that might look. We got some excellent advice on that. We talked today about disinformation. We've talked about AI. We've talked about China. But the question of attribution is so critically important to responding to cyber threats. And I can't think of anyone better than Glenn Gerstell, former General Counsel of the National Security Agency, who dealt with this day in and day out, I'm sure, who's also a SIG principal to moderate this session, and Cynthia Kaiser, who's Deputy Assistant Director of FBI Cyber. And I'm thinking maybe a few of those questions from the earlier session that John Carlin was on may come up for Cynthia. And we're pleased also to welcome to this session R. David Edelman, author of Rethinking Cyber Warfare, a first-timer to the Cyber Initiatives Group Summits. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
And Glenn, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you all.
Okay, great. And thank you, Suzanne, for the introductions as well as laying the groundwork for this. I'd like to build on that a little bit for a minute and say that attribution is, which is what is going to be our focus for the next half hour. We could spend more time on it than that for sure, but we're going to spend half an hour touching upon why we do attribution, why it's so important, what are the consequences of it, and what might be the future of attribution. But to take a step back for a second, as you said, Suzanne, at the very beginning, attribution is absolutely fundamental to any discussion of cybersecurity. Whether it's thinking about the immediate prior panel on disinformation and having an understanding of who are the actors who are spreading disinformation, to the earlier panel on China and understanding exactly the level of Chinese malevolence in this area and who are the particular actors within China promoting their cyber mischief, to just more generally ransomware, threats to critical infrastructure, et cetera. All of it is predicated on an understanding that we just accept that, notwithstanding the anonymity of the internet, the hallmark of the internet, that somehow we'll be able to figure out whose pair of hands is on a keyboard, perhaps halfway around the world, causing cyber mischief. And as a result, while it's very important, it doesn't necessarily get the attention it deserves. We're going to remedy that in a minute. And whenever there is a discussion about it, it sometimes falls into two buckets, which are two extremes that I don't think are particularly accurate. One is that attribution is just this incredibly technical thing that policymakers, let alone the general public, don't need to worry about. It's about looking at electronic logbooks in computers, understanding reams of software code, understanding changes to registries in computers, et cetera. And it's not really something that the public or the policymakers need to have an understanding of, or the weaknesses of, or infirmities of. And then the other extreme is that, attribution is just this fluffy concept that sometimes politicians will call out another country, or nation states will call out another country or a cyber actor, and there's no real proof. The proof is either hidden, it's classified, it's too technical, we don't really know what it is, maybe there's a big conspiracy behind it, and so we're not really going to focus on it. And somewhere between those two extremes, although both have elements that are accurate a little bit, lies a far more nuanced truth. And so we've got two fabulous people to guide us through some of that. I'm going to start, David, if I may, with you. I had the pleasure of working both with you as well as Cynthia when I was at the NSA, and we overlapped for a number of years, so I'm happy to see both of you here. David, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Cynthia. But David, let's start with just sort of the basics of how we do attribution, not so much the why part, but what really are the mechanics involved, what's involved in this, and maybe touch a little bit upon how that's changed, because we all know that over the years, the nature of attribution has very significantly changed.
Absolutely, and Glenn, great to be with you. Cynthia, great to see you again. And I know we have a lot of folks on this call who are deeply, deeply expert in this, but some that maybe haven't spent quite as long around cyberland. And look, the question of, how do we attribute? I think I should begin, Glenn, by saying that the we here is actually not as obvious as you might think. And we'll come back to that in a second, because the we here, who is doing the attributing, who is actually looking at this, and who's talking about it, has changed. That might be maybe one of the most important changes that we've seen, certainly in the period, say, 2014 to now. But back to the how for a second. I mean, you just think about it very basically. How do we find out, what we're talking about here is whether it's any type of cyber incident, exploitation, presence, outright attack, it's the who behind the how, right? And so the how do we figure it out? Well, one, we might hear about it from the adversary themselves, right? Sort of often underappreciated. Sometimes these are political acts that people want to take credit for, and that happens a fair amount of the time. Sometimes they're taking credit for other people's acts, and sometimes they're talking to one another, right? And we might hear about that in a number of ways that we have the ability to do that. But as you say, Glenn, there's a technical side of it, and there's this very human bit. And I think we often lose sight of the fact that, yes, there is absolutely a technical component, which we'll talk about in a second, but oftentimes people talk, they work for people, they want credit. These are political acts, are often very public acts, acts of political suasion. When it comes to the technical side, right, there are two pieces. One is coming at it from the victim side. We might understand the technical signatures, right? We understand the tactics, techniques, procedures, the TTPs from the victim side, because sometimes these tools, they're reused. Sometimes they're reused and repurposed. Sometimes they're repurposed in a way that is iconic to a particular kind of attacker. Notably, sometimes you have folks that are reusing others' TTPs in order to obscure who they really are. So there's real nuance and complexity here, but by and large, in many cases, we can see it from a technical
David,
standpoint.
just to interrupt you for a second, for the less sophisticated folks on the audience, we've got super sophisticated too people, but could you just spend a second on what you mean by the tools, the signatures, et cetera, because
sure.
how we might be able to track that, what's significant about it?
Right. So those that have been listening to the earlier parts of the day here, right, there have been discussions of everything from certain companies that are themselves building hacking tools to the fact that we've seen allegedly NSA and other tools that have been put out into the open. These are the tools that nation states and others use to get into each other's machines and disrupt each other's machines. And it is the case that while, as a general matter, cyber penetrations are ephemeral, right? We talk about how, unlike other areas of weaponry, the more the world knows about a means of attack, the less likely it is to be successful. But that said, we also heard, from Michael Daniel at the very start of this, the vast majority of these kinds of attacks and infiltrations are not very sophisticated. They're using well-known techniques. They're not using what are called zero-day exploits, right? They've never been seen before. Most of it's standard, most of it's well understood, it's just not well protected against. And so what you might see is, let's take, for instance, a hypothetical set of tools that the Chinese military likes to use. It's not just going to be used by, Colonel Xu, it's going to be used by his 15 other colleagues, maybe little tweaks here and there, but there's a way in which those of us are able to, that are on the technical side, can understand the ways in which those patterns take place and to actually sort of categorize, almost genus and species like, the types of, for instance, malware that they might use to get into a machine. So that's the technical the piece on the defense side. It's also true that, through the standard techniques that we have, law enforcement and intelligence, it's also possible that we'd be able to observe this a little bit more intimately in terms of what the attacker is doing. And that's an important part we don't talk about a lot, but is obviously an important part here, to the extent that one is able to track, for instance, pursuant to lawful authority, a criminal hacker. We might be on their machine observing them because we have that pursuant to a court order, and we'd then be able to identify who they are. And I just want to say one piece about this notion of who, because the who here, as you said, Glenn, is very nuanced. It may not be a natural person. And importantly, it may not be a natural person to be relevant here. I mean, if you think about all the things that we've heard over the course of today, right? This was not Petya actors, a particular hack, not, necessarily attributed. This was emanating from Iran. This was Russian affiliated actors. And then you could go deeper, right? This was conducted by the People's Republic of China. It was conducted by PLA Unit 61398, right? And it was ultimately a real person named Wang Dong, who was part of that PLA unit. We don't necessarily have that level of attribution for any one of these attacks. And if we do, we here being the US government, hypothetically, we might not reveal all of those components. And so when we think about how this fits in the offense defense, when we think about the foreign policy of this, which we'll talk about, I think, in a second, it's really important to recognize all of those various thresholds that might achieve an end of dissuasion, of identifying what we know, without actually revealing everything that we know, if we know it, because we might not even have a level of granularity down to, poor Mr. Wong.
I might, a great introduction, David. I might add, just from my own background at NSA, that sometimes the question of attribution grew out of or arose out of multiple sources of information. So, for example, it might be, and I know Cynthia's going to talk about how the FBI is able to work with victims and look at victims' computers with their consent. But it might be that the United States government, whether it's through FBI or overseas through NSA or something, is able to look at the actual malware, the software, the malicious payload that's injected, and see that it's has a particular style. For example, one thing that was been reported in the press a lot is sometimes malware emanating from Russia has a particular feature in it that looks to see the native language of the machine it's attacking. And if it sees that it's Russian is the language, it says, ignore that. Don't bother going after it. But if it's another language, okay. So that obviously is a pretty strong hint that it may well be Russian source, but that might not be the end of it. Perhaps that piece of information is also combined with classified information where the United States government, perhaps through the CIA or the NSA, is able to, through foreign intelligence sources, find out that a particular branch of the Russian military or the Chinese military or whatever wants to conduct a cyber attack, has a particular strategic goal. So sometimes merging all of these technical and political and intelligence sources together is really what is going to give you a more refined attribution. Cynthia, let's, I don't know if you want to comment on what David just said from an FBI perspective, but also I want to ask you a little bit about how the cyber actors have changed from the point of view of attribution. What are we seeing that's different in how the cyber actors change, and how does that affect the task of attribution?
So, I think it's changed a lot from when I first started working cyber, where, for the FBI's purposes, we may have used to have gone out and said, okay, we're going to go respond to an incident. Well, we're responding, we're going to collect information. After we collect it, we're going to analyze it. And then we're going to compare what we analyzed to technical artifacts, indicators, etc. Then we would decide, okay, how much do we want to put out publicly? And now I think it's all happening at the same time a little. We're seeing a victim, we're getting information in, we're trying to evaluate the sources. And part of that is because our actors have gone to more common and signature agnostic type behavior. And why? Because it works, it's cheap, they think it gives them some anonymity, and they can save their really expensive tools for when they need them the most. And I think that goes back to some of the things David was noting about, like, hey, it's easy, some of these attacks would be easy to defend against, if we were all taking some of these defenses. But I think when I think about like how it's also changed, to me, it's gotten harder, sure. A lot of it still has to do with actor behavior, and actors make mistakes and they slip up, and oftentimes, while it might take a little longer to figure out how they slipped up, but we can still do it. I think more so though, there's a lot more refined commentary and discussion around the decision making behind why you attribute. And I think, part of that, it all centers around really how fast we need to attribute, how specific do we actually have to be when we go out publicly with this, and then, also like what are we actually trying to achieve? Because we've all seen one agency doing one thing, it doesn't work. It doesn't matter which agency it is. It doesn't matter what the one thing it is. It's a suite of activities all combined together that have a lot larger of an impact. And so I think, that discussion's really complicated. And I'll kind of turn it back over to you in terms of, you talked about the programs that are developed and it says, okay, avoid Russian-speaking networks. But how do we know that that's Moscow? How do we know it's pro-Russian hacktivist? How do we know it's cyber criminals? And I think the better question is should that matter to us? And how much, like, at what point do we start putting some of these things within that kind of culpability range?
All good points. We're gonna get a little deeper into those latter questions towards the end of this, but let me go back to David for a minute, because I know you've been tracking this for, I don't know how many years, 15 years or so, at the White House and elsewhere. And you've just written a book, which I'm going to shamelessly plug. You didn't ask me to.
Glenn, really?
Which is Rethinking Cyber Warfare, which I'm in the process. I mention this only because I'm in the process of reviewing it for the Cipher Brief. So you'll get to see my opinion of it shortly when it comes out. But I can tell you right now, it is extremely thoughtful. But what's your sense of the trajectory of how this has changed, attribution has changed over the years? I mean, we in the early days of the internet, we did not have this level of sophisticated attribution. We all recall that the SolarWinds incident, which started arguably in late 2019, perhaps, wasn't really formally attributed to Russian actors until, I guess, early 21. Obviously, part of that is the actors had been dormant in the system for a while, but even after it was discovered in December of 20, it took months before it became public with a level of certainty. So, David, could you comment on that just a little bit, and then we'll get to some other questions.
Yeah, Glenn, it's a great point. I mean, I think, over the last 15 years, we have really swung. The pendulum has gone one side to the other. I think it started out with, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. This is going to be impossible. And even if we did know it, we could never share it, right? That was, circa 2007, 8, 9. That's what we were seeing by and large. Then, I think we get up to 2014, a sort of pivotal year that was discussed earlier in the sessions. And, we began to come to a recognition that we do have a body of knowledge, that we can actually begin to do this with some level of regularity, whether or not we want to talk about it. 2014 was a critical year for, obviously, the first time President of the United States attributing a particular cyber incident to a state-based actor. First time we had indictments that were public indictments that were based on otherwise classified information, then released in order to actually go after and have a signaling effect. I think that actually, ironically, around 2014, did create a certain demand signal. Right, we had, as you heard earlier from John Carlin, authorities to go after, using traditional sanctions authorities to go after these individuals. You had those indictments. The demand became very high, but the ability to attribute timely did not necessarily keep pace. I'm glad I think you bring us back to the present, where we know this is possible. We have the capabilities in many cases in the U.S. government to do it. We have also, I think, as a policy matter, become habituated to the idea that it does take time. And I remember conversations, in the early 2010s, we have to respond to everything in network speed. We have to be automated in our response, and that holds for foreign policy response. I think we've realized that that's not going to happen as much as we might want it. And so recognizing, as you heard earlier, that the least likely outcome in many of these cases is a cyber on cyber response, but instead a very thoughtful whole of government response that includes the full, diplomatic, information, economic, and military range of options. And I think where we are today is, a recognition that things will take time, that we have the time to, in many cases, plot out what the appropriate foreign policy response is, because this is now mainstreamed as a foreign policy issue. But I think the third bit and the curveball to all of it, which, those of us who've been in government now have witnessed for the last decade, is the private sector factor, which has come up a lot today, and we haven't, heard that in this panel yet. But the idea that a private actor might attribute down to a country, a particular attack before the U.S. government is comfortable with it, or before any government is comfortable with it. They might actually have unique visibility that we don't possess, or they might have conviction that we don't possess, which is not necessarily always, I'm sure, convenient for folks in the U.S. government. I am sure it is also inconvenient for folks on the private sector side to not have the opportunity to always share what they know. But I think that's a really important role, because if you think about political military incidents and other type intelligence incidents going all the way back, by and large, they were state-based monopolies. And here you have a case where the state has not really preserved the monopoly on attribution. And while obviously we've heard about, there's been a greater depth of collaboration, there's technical cooperation that's happening. There's great work we just heard about, working with companies to collaboratively break down, criminal and other networks that are doing these kinds of things. At the end of the day, there are still others that are going to have other access, and that has real foreign policy consequence.
Absolutely. And Cynthia, I'm going to come to you in a second about the private sector and your coordination with them. But there are times when, at least in the case of the United States government, it probably is maybe happy or at least acquiescing in the idea that of some private sector companies, cybersecurity companies, and I think of people like Mandiant, CrowdStrike, Microsoft, Recorded Future, others. There are others that have the level of sophistication to make these kinds of attribution determinations. There are times when the U.S. government is more than happy to let them go ahead with that, because if a private sector cybersecurity firm makes an announcement, it doesn't necessarily obviously carry the weight of government. Maybe allies won't be offended. Maybe third parties will react differently than if the United States government said. On the other hand, there probably are times when the U.S. government wishes, gosh, I wish they hadn't said that because we haven't yet teed up things diplomatically and internally to have a coherent policy response, and we don't want this information coming out right now. So there's obviously a dual-edged sword there. But Cynthia, could you talk a little bit about how the FBI works with private sector entities, cybersecurity firms in particular, as well as the victim companies, to try to get to the bottom of the attribution question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Glenn, you said it really well. I was going to almost dispute a little what Dave said about making us uncomfortable. I think most of the time we're fine. I don't think we used to be, right? And I think that that's part of the evolution. Is before we're like, oh gosh, like said this, we're trying to kind of create this perfectly calibrated sequence and operations, and we're going to go after them this way. And that's not really how cyber works, just in general, or how cyber actors behave. And so I think, one, it demonstrates how, when we see it, we get to see that it's like, okay, great, I saw that unclassified, they have it unclassified, right? And that's the rise of like how much better OSINT is, and open source information, open source intel, and the need for us and the government to really be integrating all of that into what we do, and not think that just because something's secret, it's better. I think it's a really great evolution to see, where we say, oh great, they put it out, and sometimes our folks will have minor quibbles. They're like, well, I don't think it's that Iran group. Maybe it's like this slightly other one that's still in the same division. I'm like, well, sometimes distinctions are a difference, and sometimes it matters, right? And we have those conversations with the private sector. But I think overall, most of the time we also know if there's going to be a major attribution, our relationship with the major cybersecurity companies is close enough now that we typically have a heads up, because they want to also collaborate with us and know, and we'll talk about that timing, and we'll talk about like if we're close and they're close and it has more impact together. We all want to have impact. We all want to be able to keep our communities safer. And so I think we have a lot of good overlap there. We're also sharing a lot of information. A lot of the cybersecurity companies are being proactive in sharing the information. The FBI also is able to use our various legal authorities to receive information from them. And it's not because they don't want to give it to us, it's because it is more legally protective and formalized when we use legal process to get that into the US government. And so we've often had those conversations at the outset. But, I think that the relationships there are just, I started out in FBI Cyber Division a little over 7 years ago, and the relationships now, there's just a really common shared sense of purpose and mission, and that really goes a long way to being able to have a better impact against the adversary and to do really good attribution on the side. And I think also, like when we're working with, asked me kind of about victims, and I could talk on that for a long time, but I think overall, what's more interesting is then the relationship between, like, kind of triangle relationship between a victim, an incident response company that might be some of those major ones we're working with, and then the FBI or the US government, and how we're all kind of trying to work together to get the right information over to us, but keep and allow companies to have the privacy they need, and figure out how we all need to be looped in and get to right on that. It's not easy and it's not perfect, but it's so much better than it was. And that's how we can really, I think, overcome some of the attribution, quote unquote, challenges that we might have, because actors have taken steps to, use hidden infrastructure or not use very specific tools.
Right. So on the assumption that Suzanne is not going to give us a half-hour extension, we've got about 5 minutes or so. And let me just turn to something we've been addressing in the background, which is sort of the purpose of attribution, sort of why we do it, what are our objectives, and maybe we can talk about how that might change. And I'd ask David and then Cynthia to just comment on it. But I'll just set the stage for 20 seconds on the point by saying that the traditional purposes of attribution have been, 6 or 7 of them that you could tick off. One is that to tell the adversary, we can see you, so it'll have some mild deterrent effect. 2 is it'll help perhaps the defense, because if we know who's doing it, we can figure out how to make sure they don't do it again to us. There's the law enforcement purpose, obviously. For the international law purpose, if we can have attribution, then it affords a legal basis for going ahead with countermeasures. If we don't know who did it and we can't say who did it, then we can't undertake some kind of countermeasure, whether it's cyber or otherwise. There's a public opinion role to it, which is that if we can explain to the general public who the adversaries are and what they're doing, that'll help improve cybersecurity. It'll make people understand the role of the government, et cetera. That's all a positive for public opinion. On the international side, we can get other nations to join us in making attributions and to work with us for cybersecurity goals, including, among other things, a potential UN cyber criminal treaty that's continues to be debated, including later next month. And then finally, if there is a group of nations that band together to come up with an attribution of a foreign actor, it increases the credibility of it. It's not just one nation saying it. So that's some of the background. David, then Cynthia, do you have any reaction to how those traditional views of attribution might be changing? Which ones are going to be morphing in the future?
Well, Glenn, you laid it all out, right? Every single one of those is an important reason to go about this. And as we talked about, the major shift here has been the willingness to do it. Also, as mentioned a little bit earlier in the sessions, willingness to do it as a group, right? I think this has been an important part of ally and friend building, as well as, one would have to assume, operational collaboration deepening between our close allies and partners. I remember 15 years ago, the discussions about cyber and NATO were halting. Well, now the threats to NATO are right at the front door. The cyber elements of this are extraordinarily clear. And one would hope that in the process of mutually attributing some of this activity that we've seen in the Ukraine and elsewhere, that's also deepening those operational ties. And so I think that's an important part that is often overlooked. It's not just about the messaging piece. The messaging is important. It's important for the adversaries to know that we're aware of what they're up to. It may have a deterrent or dissuasive effect. It certainly reflects only a sliver of what we know more broadly. And, it does, and I think this is underappreciated, get under the skin of US competitors and adversaries in some instances when we talk about this. I'll just say very, concretely, for those that have been in diplomatic engagements with the Chinese, it bugs them that everybody assumes that every hack that happens these days is the Chinese. Oftentimes they're right. And so, I think that's actually important to recognize. Maybe one incident individually isn't going to have a significant foreign policy effect, but that drip, drip, drip effect of recognizing that the lack of restraint in this space can redound negatively to a country's overall ability to win friends and allies and to have deeper military and other partnerships, I think is important. And I think we're seeing now a more robust multilateralization of that piece, as well as an expansion beyond just core military allies to others, friends that have a particular vested interest in this, including those, especially those that are in hotspots of the world right now. So those are what I see as the big change. I think that'll be difficult to reverse in a good way. I think that's actually a very important part of the evolution. I would argue it's also probably the best we can do from the sort of consummation of this norms agenda that you've heard so much about for the last 10 plus years. What's the point? The point is to create a norm against the things that we think are deeply problematic at a certain scale. And when you see other countries coming out and saying that alongside us, shoulder to shoulder, it sends that message as well. But I know Cynthia has a lot of perspective on how that's also happening at an operational level. So I'll end right there.
Yep. Well, so I think, picking up where you left off, and I'm going to shamelessly plug, I think, the FBI's role in the ecosystem here, where the normative, like the international norming effect of getting folks to, or getting countries to join us, especially when we're putting out an indictment and sanctions and rewards for justice, where it's these kind of $10 million rewards to get information leading to folks' arrests. At that point, I think you were able to get more countries on board because a lot of the evidence that's collected by the FBI or recreated by the FBI for working with the Department of Justice on these indictments, it's all unclassified. Right. And that makes it so much easier for countries to join us. You can't just it's silly to think that a politician will go out in another country and say, we're going to do this, and I can't tell you any of the evidence, but trust me, I saw a signals intelligence report. Our politicians don't want to do that either. And I think overall, being able to give the public a very detailed rundown of exactly what happened that's not easily refuted, by just saying, oh, it's you're just after us. But it's really clear. You get so many more allies on board. And a great example of that is, and I know we've talked about in these groups before, is Albania. and where FBI deployed, sitting alongside Microsoft, full access with the Albanian government, like trying to get to attribution on this. And when we got to attribution, all of it was unclassified. When we got all the technical information we collected, all of it was unclassified. It was easy to give to our partners abroad. Right. Easy to give them the information they needed, and we had many countries join us, right, in denouncing the activities that Iran did, and it had huge diplomatic consequences. So I think overall, it's being able to, I think, at multiple levels use multiple types of sources, but using law enforcement alongside financial, alongside all of these other levers we have. It's why we want to do attribution, and it kind of shows, I think, what the best effects can be.
Absolutely, it's a good note to end on. I know Suzanne wants us to end on time. I'll just add 1 2-second comment to what you just said, Cynthia, as well as David, which is, I was at a earlier conference where someone was sort of dismissing the value of attribution, particularly with actors such as Russia, that are going to just proceed with impunity, and whether we say that they're responsible or not, it's not going to have much difference. Arguably, the Chinese might be in the same boat. But I think, as you've both said, I think this is different. I think even though they may continue with impunity to go ahead with their cyber malevolence, it etches the divisions between their system and us and our like-minded allies even further, and shows that we're going to treat cyber attribution with candor and more information, and ultimately that'll have an effect in shaping international norms. A very long road, obviously. All right, Suzanne, Matt, we're passing the microphone back to you, so to speak, and let me just thank Cynthia and David again.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Suzanne. Really appreciate the opportunity.
And thank you all as well. It was another fantastic conversation. Really appreciate the insights there, particularly Cynthia, Glenn, David, all of you. Glenn, you do such a great job of doing moderator and /expert at the same time. So thanks to all of you. We really